Here we go. Are you ready? COC. Why you dealing with a cyber threat when you know you got the era right? Yeah. You are not alone, don't do it by yourself. Get you some defense will help. If you know you won't be cyber free, come and get you some COC. Satisfying controls, lock them access points. We won't disappoint. COC, fight cyber threats. Promise you will not regret. We go deep and penetrate. COC, come and see.
Hey, welcome back. Jeffrey Crump for another episode of Crump on Cyber. Very excited about tonight's episode. It's a continuation of a discussion that we had previously with Alexi Johnson around FedRAMP and FedRAMP Moderate Equivalency, in particular as it applies to this new DoD cybersecurity program called the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. As part of that program, we have this variety of these what they call Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation supplements. So organizations that are building these products for the Department of Defense, they need to meet these minimum kind of security requirements. And as part of that, and the safeguards is around conformity to this NIST standard called SP 800-171. But there's also a requirement there is if this organization that's building these products is using an external cloud services provider, that external cloud services provider needs to be able to demonstrate that they're meeting the equivalency of something called FedRAMP Moderate. In part one, Alexi, deep dive into, what does that mean? On tonight's show, we're actually going to see that materialize into this evidence and how do you actually demonstrate the conformity of that. So I'm going to add in here, Alexi, welcome back. And Alexi, you've brought somebody along here, Mark Edwards. So Mark, welcome to the show as well.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. So Alexi, maybe set the stage here around the equivalency of just a little bit more of the background, and then the relationship between your organization and Mark's organization as when it comes to this FedRAMP Moderate Equivalency.
Absolutely. So thanks again, Jeff, for having us on. Just make sure, can you hear me all right?
Yep. Sounds great.
So FedRAMP Moderate, as we talked about last time, is a little bit of addition to the NIST 853 moderate baseline. It adds some additional parameters and specifies some of the parameters that organizations are required to meet. Just as a quick, for example, policies an organization typically would determine at what frequency they're going to review and update policies. But FedRAMP specifically says you have to review and update your policies every 3 years, and you have to review and update your procedures every year. Now, I specifically use that example for the purpose of the question you ask, because the FedRAMP Moderate Equivalency has to take into account things like that. So what we did when Capture 2 Proposals approached us last year to do a FedRAMP Moderate Equivalency assessment, that's one of the things that we actually had to look at when we did a FedRAMP Moderate Equivalency assessment. We had to not only make sure that a company like theirs were meeting the NIST 853 moderate baseline, where they were saying that they were going to do specific things, but we also had to look at what were the FedRAMP moderate baseline requirements and what were the specific parameters that FedRAMP put in place, and make sure they were doing those things as well. So that's where some of the differences come in. So when a company says we're FedRAMP moderate equivalent, there are some specific things that FedRAMP requires, but also there are some things that we also have to take into account that a company is not going to be able to meet that FedRAMP requires as well. And a primary example of that is the use of a PIV card. A PIV card used for identity and authentication in a government environment. People don't use a smart card out in the civilian world for the most part. So if you're not going to actually be a federal system, you won't be using a smart card. So that wasn't something that we anticipated that they were actually going to be doing, because it wasn't an actual FedRAMP authorization that they were going for. Neither would they be using a TIC. The actual acronym is escaping me for a moment, but those are things that there would be no expectation that they would be using things like that. So certain things wouldn't be assessed, but certain parameters, certain things they would be expected to be meeting.
And you would, and just to, because we likely got some new folks on here, and maybe they didn't listen to the first part from a few weeks ago, but you're doing that in the capacity of Cerebrin as a
third-party assessment organization, a FedRAMP authorized third-party assessment organization. Now, I will say, to do a FedRAMP moderate equivalency assessment, there is no requirement to utilize a FedRAMP recognized third-party assessment organization. But I will say a FedRAMP recognized third-party assessment organization would understand the nuances of the FedRAMP program and gives a better opportunity to be able to understand the body of evidence and the specifics that are required to be able to meet the requirements of equivalency from a FedRAMP perspective.
Yeah, and the way it, really kind of stands today with, in the current construct is it just kind of says a body of evidence, right? And then it gives some examples of maybe an SSP, maybe a shared responsibility, but there's nothing that's explicitly says thou shalt have this and thou shalt use a C3P or 33AO to do that kind of work. Not today, right? Yeah. Okay. All right. So in that, along those lines, Mark, maybe do a brief introduction. We know Alexi from Cerebrin, they're 3PAO. This is what they do. They're experts in that space. Maybe a little bit about your organization, Mark, and your role there, and then how did this relationship begin? With Cerebrin.
Well, like Alexi, I'm retired Air Force, and then worked for a major defense contractor for 20 years. And about 15 of those years, I was working on a Army Mac 1 tactical system, doing software testing and the security requirements for it. And that led me into doing numerous DICAP and DIRMF certifications for our server level systems and our tactical systems. So I got into doing ATO certifications and, grinding through 853. And that experience has really helped out when I moved over to Capture to Proposal in doing this effort right here. And that is bringing us to where we can comply with our customers' needs to meet the things that Alexi's talked about.
So maybe just a bit about what is Capture 2? What do you folks actually do? What do you bring to market here?
Right. So Capture to Proposal is a business development, capture management, software as a service application that gets populated from government contract solicitation sources that contractors then can use to, develop pipelines for business capture. And the documents that we pull in from those government sources, some of them use credentials from our customers in order to access them. Some of those documents from those sources can be marked CUI. And our customers, in developing their contract proposals for an RFP, there's a potential that they could create CUI documents. So that's what really keyed us in on meeting not only FedRAMP, but also NIST 800-171 as a non-federal system and organization that has CUI. We had to meet NIST 800-171, and then as a external cloud service provider for defense contractors, then we needed to meet the FedRAMP Moderate and also the incident response requirements that were in DFAR 712.
Yeah, a great point. That there's the safeguarding element from 7012, but there's also, to your point, that incident reporting stuff that's very important. Okay, brilliant. Thank you for bringing that up as well. So Alexi, you get a phone call, email from Mark saying, "Hey, we need some help." How does that engagement kind of kick off, and how do you kind of have this conversation about, well, okay, it's a body of evidence, but that's a little vague, and so how do you kind of decide, okay, this is what we are going to want to see, and how do they get them to the point where they're ready?
We actually handle it in similar fashion to any other assessment. We didn't necessarily handle it from the standpoint of we are doing this to evaluate a body of evidence. They actually came to us seeking FedRAMP Moderate assessment, not in terms of we're seeking an authorization or security assessment under the FedRAMP program, but to be assessed under the FedRAMP Moderate requirements or controls, as well as the NIST 800-171, to be able to show that they were meeting the requirements that were going to be used against CMMC level 2 practices, to be able to have a letter of attestation from a third-party assessment organization to show that they were meeting those requirements and then they were meeting those controls. So that's ultimately what they were, coming to us for. It just so happened that it coincided with what question and answer 115 from the cybersecurity procurement frequently asked questions we're talking about as well. So it was kind of a simultaneous, type of thing that's what the Department of Defense is saying that a contractor can use as evidence that somebody is meeting the requirements. So it kind of started out as that same type of engagement.
Okay. All right. So Mark, you had a background, you had familiarity with what was, being talked about out there, and presumably when you Alexa, you're talking, you were like, okay, some of this stuff sounds familiar. So how did your organization get prepared? And then we'll kind of turn the page here and allow you to present some of this evidence, because I know there are folks out that are really kind of chomping at the bit to, okay, what does this evidence look like, that we need to, to really kind of be prepared for, or maybe even get teed up for a 3PAO here.
Well, we were doing self-assessments when we first came online several years ago of 800-171. And then when all the CMMC stuff came out, started really digging into the FedRAMP requirements and the fact that CUI was coming down the road. So we made a major decision to move to Azure Government Cloud and GCC High, and got with an organization that basically built out that environment for us. And we moved from Azure Commercial over to Azure Government and rebuilt our whole architecture in there. And that organization helped us set it up.
Let me pause you right there, because because I think we're going to find some organizations that will also want or considering kind of taking that journey. So can you elaborate on, what does that transition like from the commercial to the GCC environment?
Actually, it was fairly smooth. We partnered with a group called Summit 7, which does this sort of thing. They're a Microsoft supplier, so they came in and they built the Azure Government environment, the Microsoft 365, created all the required policies and rules, to handle data loss prevention, data loss marking within your M365, security groups, all that stuff that builds that architecture out and uses those things within Azure Government to basically get to about an 85% compliance level right off the bat with 800.171. So then that left us the shared responsibility then to build our servers and storage and all those things to meet the other requirements and to meet all the FedRAMP controls.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, fantastic. So this evidence, right? This body of evidence, what did you utilize?
So I'll just add, you said, how long did this take? So when we did that, again, my past experience, the requirements for FedRAMP and NIST are not just for the application, but they're also a lot of corporate requirements. Like Alexi said, you got to have the policies, the SSP, the procedures to go along there. So all that documentation, that takes a while. So we spent about 6 to 8 months creating all the documentation, doing our self-assessment within the FedRAMP Moderate SSP that provided from Microsoft that identifies your shared responsibilities. And once we got all that together, then we've been in discussion with Sarah Brin and provided them all that background in order to go through the assessment. Okay. So, and then your question was, I'm sorry, I jumped off there.
Yeah, no, it was really kind of just turning the page into the actual evidence itself. And you talked about the level of effort takes a while. It's, obviously sounds like to get all that stuff kind of teed up. And from a 3PO Alexi's perspective, looking at this body of evidence. And so this body of, what is the body of evidence? What, what was produced and presented to Sarah Brin in order to be able to try and demonstrate your conformity? What did you utilize for that?
Yeah, so Sarah Brin did their assessment, did the penetration testing, basically gave us a scorecard. I keep using that term from the old days, that says whether or not we implemented all those controls. And at the end of that process, they provided us an attestation letter that states that we have assessed capture to proposal to meet this number of controls for both 800.171 and also FedRAMP Moderate. So those letters of attestation are a key point to me, because they say I didn't just self-assess, and I'm telling you that I had an independent assessor come in and they verified it, and they're a certified assessor in order to do that, which provides a level of confidence that would be accepted by a contractor who may be going through CMMC assessment down the road here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Okay. All right. So, Alexi, then you want to walk us through, or Mark, you want to walk us through some of this, the evidence that was evaluated, and we take a peek at that?
Yeah, I have, let's see, can I share here?
While he's bringing that up, I just want to mention, for those who are curious, the process of a FedRAMP assessment, everybody that's probably, in the audience or that may view later are aware of the 110 requirements for 800.171 and the 320 assessment objectives for 800.171 alpha. Well, for FedRAMP Moderate, there's actually 325 for Rev 4, because that's what this assessment was based on. There's 325 controls for Rev 4, and I think at the time there were 1,025 assessment objectives. So before things were scoped out for potentially not applicable or potentially inherited, there's 1,025 assessment objectives that we had to take a look at to determine, what are we assessing or potentially evaluating for inheritance based on shared responsibility matrix for Azure Gov Cloud, and taking a look at things like that. So in terms of reviewing, policies, procedures, SSPs, diagrams, there's a great deal of work that goes into not just looking at the body of evidence, but doing the exam and interview test, having, a lot of meetings, with their team and reviewing objective evidence, because it's not an official, actual, FedRAMP assessment. We have a little bit of flexibility in terms of how we do it. Typically, if it's an actual assessment where you turn things over to a presiding body, you actually document all of the evidence and you capture all of the evidence to turn it over to a presiding body. But we don't have to turn everything over, so we do it a little bit differently. We did recorded sessions and we captured everything in video form, and documented everything that we saw that proved everything as a time-saving measure, rather than having them to give us this back or give us that back. We actually saw everything that we needed to see in that way versus the normal where we would say, give us this, give us that, give us this, give us that. We saw everything that we needed to see to be able to prove what we needed, versus, I won't say wasting time, but the assessment process can be very arduous at times when you have to go back and say, okay, now that I've seen it, you go back and you give me the screen grabs from all of those things so I can catalog it and put it in a spreadsheet and document it so I can give it back to the authorizing official so they can catalog it with all of the assessment documentation.
And what's that process like from a duration? So if you and is it pretty standardized, or is there some variables based upon the kind of cloud solution that that your client is bringing to you there?
It's a fairly standardized process for the most part. You divide and conquer in most cases. They had a fairly lean environment, not a ton of infrastructure. What you often find is that a cloud service provider, comparatively, many of your cloud service providers have far less infrastructure than, I would say, a CMMC, a DIP contractor, in terms of total assets, because their goal is to shrink it as much as they can to avoid having things assessed. So even though Mark mentioned corporate side, you're going to reduce it as much as you can, so that you don't have to worry about having any physical anything involved, and you're going to inherit as much as you can. So even though you have personnel security, and you may have your HR personnel involved to do personnel security and to do screening, you're not going to have any of your corporate equipment or any of your corporate systems involved. And because of the way, under FedRAMP, anything that affects the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of the system or the data, then if it's external, then those systems also have to meet FedRAMP requirements. So you typically want everything inside of your boundary, and you typically don't use many external systems when you're dealing with FedRAMP. So for that reason, if you're using an external system and it's not FedRAMP, you can't use it. So you're using all FedRAMP external systems, or you keep it inside of the enclave or inside of the cloud service provider. So it's typically much easier in terms of size of the cloud service offering from a FedRAMP standpoint. But when you're dealing with a DIP contractor, it's normally a much larger scope in terms of the assessment than it is for a cloud service provider.
Yeah, and it sounds like not just, you talked about the dramatic increase in the number of controls above and beyond, or, different from what we see in 800-171, but the security objectives as well. So 171 really focused on confidentiality,
right?
But this goes beyond that. It goes all the way out into integrity and availability as well.
And one of the things we mentioned last time, but this is more of a federal system. When you get a federal, when you get an authority to operate from the federal government, this is treated more like a federal system. When you actually complete a federal, when you get a FedRAMP ATO, the SSP, when it's completed, it's actually CUI. This is now a federal system. So, the concept of security protection data, as you know it from the new beginning, so to speak, from a CMMC standpoint, that's a new concept for a lot of people. But for the federal government, that's been something that's in place. When you start talking vulnerability information for a federal system, that's always been considered sensitive information that has to be protected at the level that you protect government data, because that's information that can be crippling to the information system. So that's always been information that you've had to protect at the same level, because it can affect the confidentiality or the integrity or the availability of the system if that information was compromised. So if you're going to use a vulnerability scanner that's external to a FedRAMP information system, then that vulnerability scanner has to be a FedRAMP system. So oftentimes when somebody does vulnerability scanning for a FedRAMP cloud service offering, it's either going to be internal to the FedRAMP offering inside of the authorization boundary, or they're going to use a FedRAMP authorized cloud, they're going to use a FedRAMP authorized scanner if it's going to be external, because it has to meet that same requirement.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, I'll let you, Mark or Lexley, whoever wants to kind of drive us, I kind of turn it over to you. And Mark, if you're going to drive, and then Lexley, if you want chime in, pepper in here, then feel free.
It'll be all Mark for all
Mark. Okay.
So there's an independence requirement. I'm purely an assessor as it relates to all of this, so there can be no cross anything. We are purely an assessor and not an advisor to anything that Capture 2 does.
All right. Okay, brilliant. All right, Mark, it's on you. You want to walk us through what we've got here? And
sure. Yeah. So this is not really evidence, but the first thing we provide our customers is an assessment introduction letter, which basically describes what we did, why we did it, and sort of lays out the reason for 800-171 attestation and the FedRAMP attestation, and that we believe that 3PAO attestation is required. We kind of geared it toward with CMMC because our customers, that's something they're looking to make sure that we comply with them when that hits the road here in the next year. So it's basically education. A lot of companies don't have great big IT departments, and maybe not be as educated on some of these requirements, but we have a lot of companies that do, and they ask the specific questions that we have been answering with this body of evidence. So that just kind of sets the stage for it. And then the next thing we provide is the letters of attestation from Sarah Brin that says we assessed Capture 2 proposal for FedRAMP Moderate, which included penetration testing during that period of time. And you had asked Lexi about time. I think this whole process took about 4.5 months. Once I dropped our package off to them until the letters of attestation were received, it was about 4.5 months. So the FedRAMP, says that out of the 325 controls, we implemented 317, and there were 8 that were not applicable. One of the benefits of being in Azure government cloud is a lot of those controls with media protection and physical protection, those type of things are not applicable.
Okay. Yep. Great.
And then we have the same thing, letter attestation for the 800-171, which says that, again, we implemented 109 out of the 110 controls. One was not applicable. So we provide those to the customers as evidence that, they can upload these documents if they're using this to the SPRS system to say, yeah, we're using this to show that they meet the DFARS 7012 requirements.
Okay. So is that, let me ask a quick question here to Alexei. So is that typical where you would focus on both and have this attestation of 800-171 because of 7012 and the incident reporting stuff in addition to the FedRAMP Moderate equivalency? Is that would be standard protocol?
So typically a cloud service provider would ask us for an attestation of 800-171 because they may be doing business with other agencies that are not Department of Defense. So if a cloud service provider has CUI going into their system, the requirement is to meet 800-171. It's because of the Department of Defense that FedRAMP Moderate equivalency is a requirement in the cyber incident reporting requirement. So I make the assumption that it's because they may have other federal contractors, the reason that 800-171 is the requirement. And also, I can't say for certain, but I would assume that they may have other federal contractors that may have CUI in their environment.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Thank you, Alexei. Okay, Mark, you want to continue on, please?
So the next thing we provide is the control implementation summary. This is basically the scorecard that is based upon the assessment performed by Sarah Brin that identify there's over 600 specific controls and subcontrols in this document. I just cut out a few samples here that has control ID, whether or not it was implemented, and again, all this was based off the assessment. Highlighted to point out that some of these are system specific, Capture 2 proposal, the application, but some of those are system and corporate specific. So Capture 2 as a company and the Capture 2 proposal as an application, there were controls that had to be addressed for both of those. And then there was inherited columns. So some items were inherited, but the majority of items, I would say at least 60 or 70% of them within the Azure Moderate SSP had a shared responsibility with the SaaS cloud service provider that was building within their environment. So you can see that there are inherited, like I said, inherited controls down in this column here, which a lot of those map to media protection and physical environment protection. And it goes all the way down to the SI controls. So we provide them that's basically the scoring of your SSP by the independent assessor. So that gets down into some detail. If they want to get to that, detail, and the attestation letters aren't considered sufficient.
May I ask what's the difference here between, we got some green, blue, orange?
Those are just our corporate colors. So I was being artistic. Artistic there.
All right, brilliant. Okay.
So then the other thing we provide is the shared responsibility matrix. So our customers, even though they use a Capture 2 proposal and we have the attestations, they have shared responsibilities that you see in orange here. And we have a matrix for both FedRAMP controls and also one for the NIST 800-171 controls, which can actually be mapped together. I mean, I've mapped all of the NIST 800-171 over to the corresponding 53. So to me, it's just one big pie of controls, depending on how you want to describe it. So, for example, access control. Our customers, we have a role-based user system that assigns an administrative user for their customers and based upon the role within our system, gives them access to various functions within our product, access to various document sharing folders. So they could actually say, we're going to do RFPs and we're going to store those documents in this RFP folder, but we only have certain people who have the roles to be able to access those documents. So it's their responsibility to assign their users to the roles that they need for their capture strategy.
Okay.
And then, so you can see that, you know, we've covered the board pretty good, but again, a lot of that is access control. We don't take the responsibility for security awareness and training for them. That's on that corporation. We meet those requirements for our personnel ourselves. So and then we have the same thing for 800, 171 that basically shows these are your shared responsibilities based upon those control IDs. So,
okay.
And that is the body of evidence.
That's the body of evidence. So Alexi, this is the body of evidence that's produced, or this is because you started off kind of like with this as a, you know, something that would be given to a client to understand where you guys kind of sit in the process that you went through from a 3PAO perspective, but to get to that decisioning point. So you're, you know, is this the outcome of that, or is this the input into Alexi's organization saying, hey, we feel like we're here, and then Alexi, you pick it up and then you run away and, you know, use your tools and you do the validation of the information?
We see everything. We start with the system security plan. We start with validating the scope of the assessment boundary. We start with seeing policies, procedures. You know, we pretty much the same process that companies would anticipate going through for their CMMC assessments is how we start out with this. You know, we start with a kickoff meeting. We start with, you know, validating scope of the assessment boundary, and then we start with requesting documentation, you know, system security plan, policies, procedures, understanding who the key personnel are, who has what roles, responsibilities. We review. I mean, we developed this, the SAP. You know, that's the beginning of it. You know, once the SAP has been developed, then we execute against the SAP, and then the basic construct. You know, examine, interview, test. You know, commences. FedRAMP does something that's pretty cool. They actually take NIST 853 Alpha, and they build out a full test plan for the most part. The only thing they don't do is determine what actual tests you will perform. I can actually show you that. I just had it open and I accidentally closed it. Where is it? Right here. Mark, if you stop sharing for a second, I will pull it up. So what FedRAMP does is they share screen. Let me make sure I pick the right screen.
While you're doing that, so yeah, from an organization seeking certification that's utilizing Capture 2, they're going to want to see that kind of information that we just saw up there from Mark, right? As you know, so they have confidence that this equivalency has been achieved, right? And so they feel good about it, and then they can bring that to the assessment, right? And so that's great. I appreciate that, Mark. That's going to be very valuable for the OSCs themselves, so they get a sense of, okay, what should we have from this kind of body of evidence. So that's brilliant. Thank you, Mark. Okay.
So your other option without a third party assessor is, what do they bring to say that they ensure that they meet FedRAMP Moderate, and you provide an SSP that maybe be self-assessed. And we wanted to make sure that we provide the solid evidence that reduces the risk that self-assessment's not accepted. Because if you pay money to have a third-party assessment and they don't accept your evidence, then you have the chance of failing, or even worse, if you have a contract that requires certain things, you could be in breach of contract. I saw an article just recently of a major organization being, the federal government was going back and suing them for putting, falsified data into SPRS. So
Right.
that's the type of thing that we want to make sure that we've done our due diligence to be as independently assessed and provide you solid information and can answer, where it came from.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point, because we know that the self-assessments, right? How do those occur? We have no really perspective, right? Because it's kind of on that external service, cloud service provider to kind of go through. And if we look at just an 800 171 self-assessments and how those can play out, you literally could have somebody just kind of going through going, yeah, we do that. Yeah, we do that. Yeah, we do that. Right. And in literally in 15 minutes, you could complete a self-assessment of your organization. But a self-assessment is low confidence. So an organization seeking certification, or that's utilizing these external cloud service providers, you have to take that in consideration, right? That is the lowest level, right? That is the least quality, a bit of evidence from an external provider that you can have. It's just an attestation, and you have no real context of how well it was performed. So utilizing, just like, this transition that we're, going through here with the CMMC and bringing in the independent third-party assessors, is because the DoD, right, wants higher confidence in these assessments. And so it's an excellent example of why we rank this. Why do we go to a 3PAO? Why do we have CMMC 3PAOs, right?
I do have something that I'm going to offer a comment on that right after I show you this. So what I'm showing you here is the FedRAMP Moderate Security Test Case Procedures for Revision 4. This is for Revision 4. And I just wanted to show you that when you do an assessment based on Revision 4, they basically took NIST 853 and created a document that's designed for the FedRAMP Moderate baseline. And it actually tells you when FedRAMP wants you to examine, when they want you to interview, and when they want you to test. So you'll notice there's a column for examine, there's a column for interview, and there's a column for test. So when they want me to examine something, they tell me when they want me to examine. When they want me to perform an interview, they would tell me when they want me to interview, and they want me to test. They tell me when they want me to do a test. Now, exactly what I have to interview, yes, these are potential assessment objects. We understand that. These are potential interview objects, potential test objects. When I actually develop the SAP, I determine what actual test I'm going to do for this potential assessment object. Now, some of these will have parameters, but this is actually a document that will be completed for an actual FedRAMP assessment to work through. But I'm actually excited that you just mentioned what you mentioned, Jeff, because that brings up a great point. While we're talking FedRAMP Moderate equivalency, there is something very important that I want to bring up that I'm excited about from a FedRAMP perspective. If you're talking FedRAMP Moderate equivalency versus any other framework, right? I want to bring up the baseline documents for FedRAMP Moderate equivalency for Revision 5, because what Revision 5 did, vice Revision 4, is if somebody is truly meeting Revision 5, and I'm excited that this is recorded, because when people go back and look at this, they'll understand something that maybe they've never understood before. So this is a point that even if you get a chance, Jeff, to like highlight this in another way, this is a pretty important piece here. So I'm going to go down to the CA family, because what you just mentioned was a self-assessment, right? And you really want an independent assessment. So the CA family in NIST 853 talks about assessments when it comes to FedRAMP. So I talked to you previously about parameters as it relates to FedRAMP. So let's just take a look at the CA family and what the FedRAMP Moderate baseline requires of you. So I'm going to make this as big as I can, and then I'm just going to scroll through it so that I can show you a couple of things about it, right? So CA2 says that you have to select an assessor or an assessment team. And if you can see Delta right here, it says assess the controls in the system and its environment of operation at an organization-defined frequency. And it says provide the results of the assessment to organization-defined individuals. Those are two parameters that are listed. So any parameter, FedRAMP defines certain parameters. That was in Delta, and that was in F as in Foxtrot. That was a Delta parameter. There's only one parameter, so it didn't number it. It's just Delta and Foxtrot. So you notice that if this was a FedRAMP, actual FedRAMP assessment, it has to be given to whatever roles the company wants, plus the FedRAMP PMO, and also the frequency is at least annually. So that means this company has to do, if it's a FedRAMP Moderate equivalency, they have to do it at least annually. Now, they're not going to give it to the FedRAMP PMO if it's an equivalency assessment. But in Rev 4, I'm going to bring this up really quickly. In Revision 4, there's something that changed from Rev 4 to Rev 5. In Revision 4, under Assessor Independence, and I brought up the wrong document, but I'll just tell you, there was a parameter that talked about the level of independence of the assessor, right? CA21. It was deemed to be the organization determined the level of independence.
Yeah, that's
organization determined
right.
In Revision
Yeah, that's
4.
a material change, right? Yeah.
The organization determined it in Revision 4. I think it changed in Revision 5. Let's see what it says in Revision 5. Employ independent assessors or assessment teams to conduct control assessments. There's no parameter anymore. See that? CA21, there is no parameter. So now when you talk about a body of evidence, if you can validate a body of evidence, if you can go and look at a company's security assessment plan or security assessment report, and if you can trace it to who the assessors were and validate that there was actually independence from the assessment team, now you should have some level of trust in the actual body of evidence, as long as it's a snapshot in time and not a living document based on this.
Well, and then that would require some context around the version, right? So because it was Rev 4 versus Rev 5.
FedRAMP Moderate now is at Rev 5 from here going forward, and it has been since, I believe, May.
Okay, but that's what I'm saying is.
But that's why I mentioned
somebody brings to the to an OSC, right, and then ultimately to an assessment, this attestation or this this has happened. If that was performed in the context of Rev 4, then
that's why I'm mentioning it. That's why I'm mentioning it right now. The FedRAMP Rev 5 transition plan began. Rev 5 started earlier this year, and their transition plan is underway. There are dates that are published on the FedRAMP website. So that's why I'm highlighting it right now. The transition plan is in effect. So these are questions that should be asked by companies who are pursuing services from cloud service providers that are providing services that are providing bodies of evidence. They should also be asking questions about revisions. Are you Rev 4? Are you Rev 5? If you're
Yes.
Rev 4, it's 2023. What's your transition plan to get to Rev 5? Who did your assessment? What
Yeah,
level of independence did they have?
What's the standard duration for the validity of the FedRAMP assessments? Same as 3 years?
No,
Okay.
it's 1 year.
1 year. Okay. So
why is it 1 year? Because what does it say right here? Do an assessment annually.
yeah, annually. Yeah. Okay. So that's excellent.
So here's how the FedRAMP program works. An official FedRAMP assessment has continuous monitoring built in. So if it's an official FedRAMP assessment and you have an authorizing official, you'll do continuous monitoring and you do a subset of the security controls annually. You don't do a full security assessment every year. You technically have a provisional ATO and you maintain your provisional ATO through continuous monitoring. You submit vulnerability scans monthly to the authorizing official. You submit significant changes and they approve them. They can request specific things from you. You submit incident notifications to them. If they think that something's afoot, they'll say, get your 3PAO in there, let them assess this type of thing. If you had POAM items when you got your ATO, they can say, hey, I want your 3PAO to assess them at your annual security assessment, plus these core controls as well. You know, there's a continuous monitoring process. And if you're not up to snuff on your continuous monitoring, you can lose your authority to operate. And then we're not going to use you anymore type of thing. But so the difference is when you're not under continuous monitoring, what's now the burden for the program, which is why what Mark showed you is it wasn't a risk-based approach. It was the controls assessed. And that's why the letter didn't say from Sarah Brin, we assess the risk to be this, because we're not providing a recommendation to an authorizing official to say, we assess the risk of the information system to be this, because it's not the RMF process. FedRAMP is RMF for cloud service providers to the federal government, to an authorizing official. That's not what it is when you're dealing with this process. It's ultimately, it's a different process. It's something different. It's something new. So we at Sarah Brin, we're actually looking at this process differently for what a FedRAMP Moderate equivalency assessment is and how to make it provide the requisite value that it's intended to provide to, you know, what do companies need to see when they see a FedRAMP Moderate equivalency assessment? And like, what does that mean? How do we provide the appropriate value when we provide a document back to say XYZ? Like what do companies need to see? What's the value? What value do we provide? Because it's a snapshot.
What do you expect to see in the final CMMC assessment requirements?
You know, I don't want to offer that type of conjecture because you know, somebody's going to look back at this a year from now and say, you were wrong. But honestly, I would expect something to come out and say, to go in line with what Rev 5 said, it's going to have to be an independent assessment, because that's exactly what Rev 5 says. It's going to have to be an independent assessment to be able to show equivalency, because that's what the baseline says. The baseline says you have to have an annual assessment, and there has to be an independent assessment based on CA2. What do you call those things with the parentheses? I always draw
the organization defined parameters.
No, you have the controls, and then you have the
objectives.
No. I'll remember.
All right. Oh, what? All right. Let me just. So, for an organization,
control enhancements.
Okay.
Have the control and control enhancement.
Okay. All right. Got it. It's just a matter of time. It comes to you. All right. So, if we think so in that context, then Alexei and Mark, then you've got this this baseline attestation, and then you go into this annual process of some of the controls being reassessed, revalidated on an annual basis, and then or is it, because I think that's what I heard you say, Alexley. So how do you, at what point do you get back to, or what's the cycle where I have, the full coverage over this period of time? So is it one, okay, so you get this baseline assessment, and then next year you have to do 30%, the next year 30%, the next year 40%, and now you're back to whole, or back to full assessment?
I think it's too new. So the FedRAMP Moderate equivalency hadn't really been defined by the Department of Defense to know what that meant previously. I think they first answered the question in late 2021 or something like that. So it was new. So I think when Capture 2 approached this in 2022, it was in response to them putting that out because it was new. So I don't think there had been an answer to what this was supposed to look like. So I think Capture 2 and many other companies are trying to figure out what the approach is supposed to be honest.
Yeah, because I'm, as an assessor, right, my perspective is, okay, so I've got this client, right, that's utilizing Mark's system. Great, fantastic. 2022, 2023, they got this attestation from Sarah Brin, fantastic. But I'm coming in, I'm going to do an assessment in 2025, right? We're going forward 2 years now. What am I still relying on that assessment from 2023, or am I relying on that plus some kind of an annual iterative additive reevaluate? You know what I'm saying?
Here's the real question. Are you a CMMC assessor only, or are you a CMMC assessor with knowledge of FedRAMP, or are you a CMMC assessor plus a FedRAMP assessor?
Well, I'm actually
a FedRAMP assessor.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm better in the context of an OSC, right? What does the OSC need to have? What are they going to want?
Know what the FedRAMP Moderate baseline requires. That's the question. FedRAMP Moderate equivalency means an independent assessment annually.
Yeah. Okay. So annual. So you got it, next year, right? So every year for external cloud service providers in this context, Rev 5, yeah, that attestation lever. So Mark's team's going to have to go through this every year.
However,
we're in the process right now of updating documents to the Rev 5. They came out in May.
Because it takes a while. It takes a while to transition documents
right.
And whatever technology requirements go along with that. But here's a question as well. Because FedRAMP uses a continuous monitoring process where you do a third, is that an acceptable philosophy for a cloud service provider to use to have a system security plan? To have a security assessment methodology that says we're going to do the same thing. Well, we're going to have a process that says we're going to do a third.
Mm-hmm.
Is that okay?
Yeah, well, we'll see.
You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. No, I totally get it.
Right. But who will deem that okay or not okay? Because there's no process.
Right.
I think it should be okay, but there's also no presiding body over it, and it's not a risk-based approach. It's just, do you have a program where you're working to meet the FedRAMP Moderate equivalency?
Mm-hmm.
Right, is the key.
Yeah, we've got a question from Corey Morelli. He says, so, and this, it goes back to probably 15-20 minutes ago. So think about what we were talking about back then. So, are your interviews of all employees, or are they just senior management, or for let's say QMS policies that they only interview the quality manager and reference back when they don't know that they will ask and bring in a supervisor until the question is answered in a satisfactory manner. At what point does awareness of AC policies become a failure point?
So it's very similar to what you'd expect from like a CMMC type. It's who owns the control. The expectation is that every control from a FedRAMP perspective. So I can speak to what I know of Capture 2. They actually use FedRAMP templates with their documentation. So every control was listed with somebody. They use that same flow and formatting with their documentation.
Mm-hmm.
So it was easy to follow along with who did what type of setup. With everything that Mark mentioned in terms of what his background was and things like that, they kind of operated in the typical traditional government background. So I won't speak to how they do it. I'll use my experience with how other companies operate. There are some companies that fail objectives because of what you're describing in your question. Their interview fails them because they're not following what their policies say. If their SSP says something or if their policies say something, because quite frankly, the way this works is all you have to do is let your SSP say what you plan on doing. Let your policies dictate what management expects. Let your procedures say what you're actually going to do. And then when we interview the people who are responsible for doing it, they need to be succinct in saying that they do what the procedures say. All we're doing is validating that that's what's happening. And if they're saying something different, there's a problem.
Yeah, but FedRAMP is part of the 3PAO process. You don't have what they really kind of have in the CMMC with regard to this limited practice deficiency program where, hey, the control's in place if it's a limited impact control and, the control's in place, but you get to fix the documentation. And at the end of assessment, you got 5 days to course correct that.
But it doesn't
you don't really have that.
It doesn't mean they failed the assessment. But what I'm saying is it's a finding. It's a finding nonetheless. So the document that I was showing you all where examine, interview, test, if they're saying that they do something in their procedures, but I've interviewed them and there's a deficiency, then I'm going to document an observation that there's a disconnect. I'm going to document the observation that there's a disconnect, and I'm going to put I'm going to identify a risk associated with that, and then I'm going to quantify that risk, and then I'm going to put a one-line recommendation associated with that, and that'll go into the risk exposure table, and that'll come in there as a finding. They may, depend on what it is, they may correct it before the final report, but it'll be documented and identified as a risk, and it'll go into the SAR. They may, depend on what it is, they may fix it before close out, or they may not. But it'll be documented as a finding.
Yeah, for example, you would have a control that said you configure your firewalls for denial and allow whatever, and the interviewee, that might be your director of engineering or one of your engineering guys, and that would be the guy who'd be interviewed to say, demonstrate that you do deny all and allow by exception type of thing. So all of our again FedRAMP SSP templates, every single item had, here's the people you would interview, and those people had reviewed those documents before we ever provided them to Sarah Brin, so they knew they were on the hook to be able to answer those questions.
Right, but Alexa, you're generating that as a finding, and so if you had findings, right, for Capture 2, there's an expectation? Why does that matter? Mark, are they not going to be the equivalency of FedRAMP Moderate, or is it, hey, this is just what we saw? They got to 317. They had, let's say, 7 that were not applicable, but there was one finding, right? Is that how that would have communicated?
To be honest, that's up to Does that mean you're not equivalent?
Yeah, that's kind of the question here.
I don't think it means you're not equivalent, because guess what it means to implement the FedRAMP baseline. It means that you assess your system and the weaknesses, their deficiencies, you document them in a POAM, and you develop a plan of action to remediate them.
Right. And POAMs, right, are, you know, if you look
That's a
at
part of the
at least,
process.
yeah, if you look at the DoD assessment methodology, well, we mark those as implemented, right? It's like,
Well, the DoD assessment methodology, but
yeah, but it's just,
but from
it's
a FedRAMP standpoint, see that's the
the
problem.
same mentality though, isn't it?
Well, no,
Because
the FedRAMP methodology is different. So if you do the FedRAMP methodology with the way that it's intended, there is an authorizing official. So what would happen is you would quantify risk for every single finding, and we would give a risk recommendation to the authorizing official. We would say, I recommend this system for authorization based on the level of risk that we quantify. Well, who do I make that recommendation to in a letter? I don't make that recommendation, so we don't quantify risk in these letters. We're just really telling you what we found.
Gotcha.
We're ultimately validating Mark and Capture 2. They have a system security plan. Let's just say that in their system security plan, they said all 325 controls were implemented. But we found in our assessment that all 325 were not implemented. So we would give them a security assessment report that would say 258 of them were implemented, and the rest were not implemented. So what we would expect them to do as a result of the letter that would say that, and the security assessment report that would say that, is that they would update their system security plan to match that, and that they would update their control implementation summary to match that, and they would update their customer responsibility matrix to match that. And that's what their body of evidence would say that they would provide to their customer for the snapshot in time based on that assessment. And until assessed again, that's what they have from us.
Right.
Now they have living documents, yes, but that's what goes with the assessment. That's what goes with the letter.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah,
because that's all you can do until assessed again.
Right. Yeah,
that's all you can do.
Right. So
my question is basically around, is the CMMC, is the C3PO assessor the authorizing official that will look at a company's evidence and say to the government contractor that we will accept that risk, that their body of evidence, that they're FedRAMP equivalent. So if you have a self-assessed body of evidence and you have an attestated independent assessment, they may accept the self-assessed risk. I don't know. I guess we'll see.
I don't believe that they're going to leave that to the assessor. I think that when this rule drops, that we're going to have something more concrete. I really believe that.
Yeah.
I believe that we're going to have something concrete from the Department of Defense that's going to say it's going to require an independent. But realistically, Rev 5 already says it.
Yeah, but
Rev 5 says you have to have an independent assessment annually. That's what Rev 5 says.
Yeah, but Alexa, to your point, you come in, you assess, you may have findings. Is that at what point does it become, well, you are not FedRAMP Moderate equivalency? One finding, does that kick you out of that phraseology, that place? Or is it 10? Or are they going to do something like, they're proposing 80% no high value, and they're going to go off and start weighting, controls, and
that's the challenge right there.
Yeah, we have no idea.
That's the bigger challenge. It's because you could be, in my opinion, you could be FedRAMP Moderate equivalent and have lots of issues. Which issues are the ones that are going to say enough's enough?
Right. Yeah, because that's kind of where they got to, or with the DoD assessment methodology, while they have the objective, the weighting of the controls, so they could make that kind of decisioning. So it sounds like what we need is the equivalent.
Do that for FedRAMP.
For FedRAMP, yeah.
Because if they do that, they'll make our jobs a little bit easier, because then they'll make ultimately they'll take the 3 PAOs risk recommendation away if they decide here's the risk-based decision. They'll take our risk recommendation away.
Yeah,
Because
they
right now,
they will define what
recommendation
that
ours.
is.
Right.
Yeah.
Right now, that risk recommendation is ours. So if they decide, I mean, that's our job right now, is to make that risk recommendation as 3 PAOs. It solely rests with us in FedRAMP right now. Now it's up to the authorizing official to, you know, accept or not accept that recommendation. But right now that rests with the 3 PAO.
Yeah. I would think that they would want to take that on. That would seem reasonable. And that,
Corey, I hope we answered your question there.
Yeah, right, Corey. Corey, you'll have to post it again or something like that. But
if we detect that there's not congruency in the group, we just don't deal with a lot of back and forth in that. Like if you know, if the person you put forth as the person that we're interviewing, if they ain't got the sauce.
Right. Yeah, that's a problem. That's a problem for FedRAMP. That's a problem for CMMC. That's a problem, right? Yeah, that's why we tell you, you know, when you go to the CMMC training, look, hey, you if you figure out in your organization you got somebody you want to bring to the interview, you darn well better meet with that person ahead of time and do your witness coaching, right? And this is who you gave me. Make sure they know this is the right person and they are prepared for this. Okay. Don't just take the name and run with it.
This is Hunger Games, okay? This is the person you gave his tribute, okay? So you don't get a second chance.
That's right. Absolutely.
Better send a group in there. It's not that bad.
All right. Hey, gentlemen, it's been amazing. Great session. I really appreciate it. Mark and Alexi, again, great having you on. Very informative session. I'm confident the folks listening will get some great value out of this. So thank you again, gentlemen.
There is one thing that I need to say.
Yes, sir.
And everybody that hears this, y'all can feel free to find me on social media if you like, and just go ahead and throw some happy birthdays out there, because today's my birthday.
Oh, well, absolutely. Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
How old I am doesn't matter. 44.
Brilliant. All right. Thank you. Happy birthday, Alexi. All right. Mark, thank you again for joining. It's been great.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Alexi.
All right.
Thank you.
Now you know you're feeling better after deep dosing on COC. Crump and Cyber did you good, babe. Gave you what you want, now you say. Well, we've got to go. See you next time we have the show. I know you love that COC.